This is Aliens and Artists, part 2 of our conversation with Eric Wargo. I'm your host, Stuart Davis. We begin part 2 with a discussion around synchronicity as being what Eric considers misrecognized precognition. So Eric, one of the ways we may be misunderstanding precognition is that there is an incommensurate degree of reporting the significant precognitions, of course, because those events impact us. They carry the signal, the meaning, the emotion. Naturally, we're going to disproportionately report those experiences, document them. Whereas dreams about the sink clogging up or other mundane aspects of day-to-day life won't carry urgency. So we end up with a body of documentation that is lopsided, understandably, toward the significant.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. Yes.
Okay, so following on from that, if the Jungian attempt was toward collapsing the time dimension, but the real understanding of synchronicity is in this expanded time dimension, and we look at how synchronicities run through NDEs, contact, paranormal experiences, and it formulates a signaling system, mile markers that people measure their life by, which is to say it's common, for instance, for spiritual practitioners to use synchronicity as a confirmation event.
Yep.
It's always tempting to regard synchronicity as affirmation from the universe that I'm moving in the right direction. So what I'm asking you is to reframe that for us in what might be a more accurate accounting of what synchronicity is and how we should or should not use it in our lives. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I would love to answer this. That's what a lot of my forthcoming book is about, actually. There's a section on synchronicity and how to rethink it. Yes, that's how people take it. They take it as a thumbs up, a signal that you're on the right track or whatever in your spiritual practice. What the problem with that is that the problem with the Jungian idiom is that it sort of removes the reason for these synchronicities. It removes it to this kind of archetypal domain that's divorced from our own lived experience, our own lives, and it obscures the fact that we're the ones creating synchronicities. We're the ones doing it, because it's all synchronicity is misrecognized precognition. Synchronicity is what it feels like when we precognitively orient toward rewards in our future and are not aware that that's what we're doing. So when we have that reward, when we have that coincidence, when we have that, we live an experience that we dreamed about 2 days ago, because at this point we lack this concept of precognition, a robust kind of cultural framework for understanding that, we will grope for this Jungian, this handy Jungian term, synchronicity. And it's a nice word, it sounds all kind of like electricity, it's kind of exciting and sounds good. And we'll say that, and we'll assume that this is some higher intelligence orchestrating these experiences, for our benefit, or to send a signal to us or whatever, and not realize that it's our own brains doing it. Our own, we are orienting. We are sort of, one of the metaphors I use is dowsing. We are dowsing for rewards in our future, and we're orienting towards those rewards in the landscape of our future. And when you have that realization that this is you creating these experiences, it empowers you to learn how to create them on a daily basis. I mean, it's rather than sort of wait for a synchronicity to happen because you think it's a signal that you're on the right track in your spiritual practice, you can actively produce these experiences by engaging in certain practices, meditative, dream work practices, a number of others that will generate precognition, that will get you in touch with your precognitive, sort of consciously in touch with your precognitive abilities. I mean, we're all precogs and we're all orienting in the world precognitively, but we simply call it intuition or whatever. We're not aware of it. But once you become aware that it's you're doing it, you're creating these experiences, It's very empowering to sort of become a conscious precog rather than wait for synchronicities to kind of validate or affirm what you're doing.
So that's the good news of this umbrella of subjects we've been covering. Far from being passive experiencers of random synchronous confirmations which are dispensed from higher powers, which are inscrutable higher powers, the good news is that this can be situated in our lap. We can take an empowered role. We can reliably cultivate an increase in our own precognition and also a better order of understanding them. I love the dowsing metaphor. Ironically, one of the things that will probably happen in your forthcoming book when we set up a visual and a depiction of this all calls to mind magic, as in bringing experience into accord with one's will. Attractive to a lot of people. It's easy to see how a few increments over from I'm going to do this to get more synchronicities could be I'm going to have more sex. I'm going to get a shiny red bicycle or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
Does that land at all for you?
Yeah, totally. And magic has always been, I've never been drawn to kind of magic before the last few years because I don't know, it was kind of alien to me a little bit. And I sort of preferred my kind of Zen, approach, and I was very happy sticking with that. But,
yeah,
in the last few years, it's become much more apparent that, everything I'm talking about is a kind of reframing of everything that, chaos magicians are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, you talk about will, one of the things that has always put me off magic and the sort of idiom of magicians is this talk about will and intention. I don't know what it is. I think it's probably my personality type or something. I'm very just sort of naturally a Taoist.
Mm.
I mean, if I practice Zen, really deep down, I'm just a Taoist in that I just sort of, my comfort zone is letting things happen and watching. And that's kind of how I feel most powerful in the world. In fact, is by not imposing my will. And it's just kind of the way I've always been. And it's worked okay for me. It's not gotten me a sports car, and I'm not rich, but, it's gotten me, I think a lot of good things in my life. And one of the we'll call it discovery insights that I've had over the last couple of years since I wrote Time Loops, it was there's a hint of it in Time Loops, but I hadn't quite articulated it to myself. And I articulated a little better in the forthcoming book. The Time Loops framework really kind of reframes these terms will and intention. And I'll throw a third one in there, desire. That these three things, I believe, and again, this is going to, offend people's knee-jerk free will sensibilities, but I just ask them to indulge me. I think those three things are misrecognized precognition, misrecognized premonition. That will is really misrecognized premonition. We are what we experience or what we interpret as our will deep down is a kind of retrospective reframing of precognizing our successes. And I mean that on a moment to moment basis. I really am serious that I think that there's almost kind of a new kind of cognitive psychology almost embedded in this idea, this kind of intersection between what magicians are talking about and what I'm talking about with time loops. That will, intention, the same way, when you set an intention for something, I've got so many examples of this in my work with some precogs that I work with, where they'll set an intention and it'll come to fruition, but it'll come to a fruition in a way that they realize that their original intention was precognitive of that. It wasn't, it was precognition that caused them to have that particular intention and not some other intention. You see what I'm saying? So will and intention, and I would add desire to that too. I think that desires are often kind of a misframing or misinterpretation of precognition of things that we don't even know that we want yet until we get them. They're rewards that we don't know that we wanted, but we precognize that we want that thing. So I don't know. That's probably sort of sounding obscure, but I just think that there is a very rich territory here of sort of overlap between what I'm talking about and what I think magicians are up to and what they're talking about. And it's just in the last year, on Twitter, I've started interacting with more magicians and realizing that yeah, there is this like real important overlap that's worth exploring. So I'm one of my intentions is to read more in that area. It's like I've got piles of books that I need to read, but I'm slowly ordering magical books too, and try to understand, get in that mindset.
Well, there is a fascinating nexus here, an intersection of some gorgeous potentials. I think you're right that there may be even an emerging field. What I'm ruminating on now regarding will, intention, and desire is that it doesn't feel vague. What you're describing is a magnetic operation, as in there's a magnet in the locus of the self, sending, receiving, and orienting itself toward the greatest magnetic attraction, which is in alignment with benefits and rewards for the self. So those rewards are a beacon. That all makes immediate sense. Where it gets interesting, for example, for me, is when we include even simple systems of psychosocial development, the development of the self. Obviously, the self is not one thing, not one perspective, not just one desire. There are levels of development. There are myriad perspectives within a self. So there's a layered unfolding. But suffice to say that the various levels and layers within one individual can have their own desires, their own needs. So the question I have around this, these various layers of self moving through time is actually an array of magnets, not just one. There's a multiplicity of desires and goals within each identity. And that's where I think premonition and retrocausation could get really, pardon my French, but could be a bit of a mindfuck to sort through all of that in this model. Does that evoke any thoughts from you about that assembly of the self?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, we're not. I think there's a kind of there's a tendency in most psychology, especially like psychoanalytic schools, to simplify desire and motivation in a way. I mean, you may have a few, unconscious and conscious, but I think it is more like you characterize it. There's just sort of, infinite little, not infinite, but, many, 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 many little desires and motivations that all sort of competing in a very complex organism, where we have, there are all kinds of little survival relevant impulses and needs and whatever, and they're all kind of operating in simultaneity. And yes, if those are all really time loops, then it's like, yeah, it's a incredibly complex picture. But and it's why I think that we are actually built of time loops in a sense that time loops are kind of like the four-dimensional versions of cells in our being. That our four-dimensional structure is really built of, all the way down to the finest level of these causally circular structures that I'm, for convenience, calling time loops. And there's some physical basis for this, because even physics says that. Quantum physicists will describe the quantum foam, where particles arise from nothing and then sort of collapse together. Particles and antiparticles arise and they collapse. Well, there's some reason to believe that particles and antiparticles might be the same particle, but just going backward in time. One of them is, and that those are little causal loops. And so, even on a particle level, our universe may be built of time loops in a sense. And I think that that's what living organisms are. They're sort of taking that quantum ability to tunnel to some sort of optimum, to tunnel to survival, and they're scaling it up. They're scaling up these basic quantum phenomena like tunneling, and nervous systems are like a further iteration, scaling up this kind of orientation towards success and survival. So in the new book, I even have a chapter where I'm kind of like trying to integrate this framework with kind of a more new thought, kind of standard new thought framework, which might describe success as a function of mind, or success is built on mind. Well, I'm trying to flip that and say, no, actually mind is a function of success. That is our intrinsic success as living beings that are sort of binding time and harnessing this power of retrocausation and precognition and sort of scaling it up. And the mind would kind of almost be an emergent property within the sort of larger success of the quantum universe.
Very interesting. I can't let our time run out without getting into one particular fold within these topics, which is remote viewing as misidentified precognition. Remote viewing has had some pretty impressive staying power. It's had periods of waxing, periods of repose. Now we're seeing this interesting moment where TTSA, Hal Puthoff, his team of people who had cultivated Ingo Swann, McGonagall, how their talents were enlisted and remote viewing became a tool employed by the government, a very exotic form of quasi-espionage, if you will. You have published very interesting writings characterizing remote viewing as misidentified precognition. I don't think this idea has really gotten out there yet. I would love to hear you walk us through why you think that's the case and how this might adjust our view of what remote viewing is, why it's working when it is working, and what it is not, why it's not working when it's not working. So does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm definitely, I'd love to address this. And I will hasten to say that I don't have the final answer on this question. It's more, I'm raising the question. And I'm not the first one to raise this question. Even from the early days of remote viewing at SRI in the 1970s, to bring it back, circle back to Jacques Vallée, he was friends with the folks one floor down doing the remote viewing research, even though he was working on a completely different project. He was working on the ARPANET. But he was having lunch with those guys and sharing ideas. And he would, and this is even in his journals from the period, he would have lunches with the researchers and say, well, how do you know that the remote viewer is being clairvoyant, seeing something at a distance? How do you know that they're not precognizing the feedback they're going to get later, or they're not precognizing the book where they're going to read about the story of how they precognize something to distance? How do you know that? And his colleague, and the SRI guys really didn't have an answer, at least not accessible in his writings. And they ultimately did some small studies about testing how important feedback was, and discovered that, it's pretty important, but they never really pushed those very far. And over the years, the question has persisted, the idea that, well, how can you ever tell the difference between, what may feel like mentally visiting, a site in Russia versus how that may be what it feels like to the experiencer, but how can they ever know that it's not they're precognizing, reading about that site in Russia, after the experimenter tells them, hey, good job, which would be a time loop, right? And one of the case studies that has always been sort of invoked as a counter argument to that idea is a very famous case, and Russell Targ writes about it in a lot of his books, where Pat Price, the sort of star remote viewer for about a year in the mid 70s, he remote viewed this site in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan, and described, a few features pretty uncannily that were viewable in a CIA aerial reconnaissance photo that he was shown shortly afterwards. But he also described features that were supposedly only confirmed in a magazine article that came out 2 years after he died in 1975. So this has often been cited as, and Targ cites this case as an example where, well, there's no way he could have received feedback on this because he died before there was feedback available. Well, Targ has often cited this as an example why remote viewing can't just be precognition of feedback, because one of these things that Price saw was only confirmed in a magazine article a couple of years after he died, so there's no way he could have received feedback. So people were continuously citing this case, and I delved into it, and I actually found original session transcripts. It turns out the thing that he supposedly precognized that was confirmed in the magazine article was actually not as it was recalled by Targ. Targ was writing his account of this 20 years after the fact. So I think there was, faulty memory a little bit there. Targ is wonderful, by the way. I mean, his books on remote viewing are awesome, and they were actually a big inspiration for me when I was getting into this field. I hasten to say that. But when you look at the actual session transcripts, it doesn't support this idea that Price was seeing something that he could not have received feedback on. All of the real hits in the sessions were things that he was given feedback on almost, like the next day. So I think I think this contention that remote viewing could just be precognition is very controversial. I think a lot of remote viewers balk at it because it doesn't fit with their preferred idea of what they're doing. It also doesn't support, I think, the people's preferred idea that this is somehow consciousness that's non-local in nature and extending free of the body and so forth. I think there's a kind of wish for that to be true also, and the precognition only hypothesis doesn't support that. It can't be used to support that kind of metaphysical worldview. So I think there's a lot of resistance to this hypothesis. And at this point, it is only a hypothesis because it has not really been tested that well. And there's one really good way to test this. And I hope that someone, reading my work will decide, hey, let's go do this. Let's actually do these experiments. And here's what you would do. You would take 5 of your best remote viewers, put them in a room or put them in separate rooms, whatever. Have them remote view a target that's, say, an hour's drive away. A double blind, so the experimenter doesn't know what the target is, but have it be a location that's about an hour away. Have them all remote view that target, drawings, whatever. Okay, and then after the session, get them in a bus and drive them to that site for the same way that they used to conduct the early remote viewing trials. They would have the person in the lab do the remote viewing, then they would drive him to the site and see how well he did. Well, in this case, during that hour when they're being driven to the site, you have a Confederate plant a very big and obvious sculpture at that location, and then see what do their remote viewers' descriptions correspond to. Do they correspond to the site without that sculpture, or do they include that sculpture? And if you do enough, doing one such experiment may not tell you that much, but doing a lot of experiments where you manipulate the feedback in some way. You could do this with pictures, have them remote view a picture, but then unbeknownst to them, substitute it with a different picture when you're giving feedback. This kind of protocol where you're manipulating feedback would, I think, ultimately reveal pretty strongly the role of precognition in remote viewing. And, my hypothesis is that you'd find that people are always precognizing what they're going to see later, that they're not, that remote viewers are going to see in their mind's eye what they're going to see later. They're not seeing in their mind's eye a reality as it exists separate in space-time. And there's a lot of evidence for this view just in the psychical literature more broadly. Sort of first scientist to take seriously precognitive dreams. He wasn't a scientist, I'm sorry, he was an engineer, but J.W. Dunn, back in the early years of the last century, he discovered that this was the basis of precognitive dreams because he sort of took a forensic approach to his dreams, comparing the sort of feedback experiences that he would get, like a story in the news versus the real event, and realized that, well, he was dreaming about the news story. He wasn't dreaming about the real event. And this recurs again and again and again in the sort of history of informal psychic experimentation.
It sounds so affordable, not difficult to run these experiments. Doesn't seem that it would be terribly involved. I wonder how it has not happened. Do you have any inclination to put together a study like that, or a few, perhaps? If you're already putting together a community of people contributing to the dream precognition catalog, is there anything on the horizon we can look to where these kinds of experiments can be performed? It doesn't sound like much of a hurdle to get there, right?
No, but you've got to have at least some wherewithal to do it. I mean, I don't have the time, and I don't have the resources to do.
Set that up, Eric.
Even set that up. No, you're right. I mean, we're not talking anything high tech. Yeah, I mean, I hope someone does it. I mean, there are people in this field who do have the resources. I'll tell you, I suspect that there's a resistance to this idea, both because I think, first of all, people right now are very, very gung-ho and wedded to the sort of non-local consciousness idea. And sort of anything that sort of challenges that, I'm kind of an outsider to parapsychology, because I think the mainstream right now in the field is very much towards this kind of omniscient mind, non-local consciousness, limitless mind is what Russell Targ calls it, view. So I think there probably isn't a lot of motivation to do it. Hopefully at some point there will be motivation to do it. I'm sure at some point someone will do these experiments. So I suspect there is maybe a little bit of resistance. It also is the case, interestingly, that most of the big names in parapsychology over the last couple generations, in fact, really since Rhine's day, the bulk of the researchers have been not psychologists or cognitive scientists. They've been physicists and engineers. And, the Rhines were botanists, by training. There's a tendency to want to put these things in a framework that makes sense to a physicist. And things like signal transmission and quantum entanglement and that kind of thing, they would love to put these phenomena in a framework that makes the most sense to those fields. So I suspect there's a kind of subtle professional bias within the field that is also kind of might also act as a barrier against conducting those kinds of experiments. But also there's a third reason probably these experiments have not been done. And that's that I think, what I'm sort of imagining is the kind of experiment that you would run in a standard psychology laboratory, which is always involving deceiving the subject in one way or another. But I think that given the sort of close relationship between experimenters and remote viewers, and there's a desire, I think, not to deceive anybody. I think trust plays a big role in creating the sort of kind of safe space to access psychic ability. I think there are all kinds of reasons why experimenters would probably be reluctant to deceive their subjects in significant ways. Although I think that the kind of thing where I'm talking about, like planting a sculpture or whatever, you're not like just doing something like just showing them incorrect feedback. You're subtly altering feedback in a way that may not transgress those bounds so much. But I don't know. I think there may also be that kind of dimension going on. I mean, it's, one thing that's unmistakable is it's very hard to study these phenomena scientifically. There are all kinds of difficulties. And unfortunately, skeptics just sort of leap on that statement as an excuse, for why the science isn't more robust and obvious or whatever. But those difficulties are very real.
Are you optimistic about them? These intrinsic obstacles creating such difficulty in studying such phenomena? Even when we are looking at the seat of the self as a corridor in time, the four-dimensional glass football, that all being inherent in human consciousness, that assembly, every time we get into physics, we're talking about an objective domain, an objective methodology. The subjectivity, the intersubjectivity really seems to start to fuck with things, as we've seen with great hilarity in quantum physics, in that Pauli effect kind of way, if you will. Do you feel optimistic about us resolving and moving beyond these concerns that have tripped us up in this regard? Or does it look messy for the foreseeable future?
No, I am very optimistic for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it's going to have a trickle. Its acceptance of these things is going to have to trickle down from physics. And the thing is, physics is getting there. There's a lot of recognition that quantum physics is in a crisis, and you're getting there needs to be a new framing. And I think Niels Bohr was a very powerful personality, and he sort of rammed his Copenhagen interpretation down the throats of his students and subsequent generations. But that dogma is breaking down. People are realizing that it's not enough to say just that nature is random on the smallest scales. It doesn't really wash. And ultimately, quantum physics is reaching its limit as to what it can explain as long as it's working within that framework. So you're seeing people offering new interpretations, including the retrocausal interpretation. Retrocausation is not a new idea. I mean, this was broached back in the 40s or 50s, but now it's getting taken more seriously. You have more young researchers studying it. Got a few experiments that I talk about in my book, Time Loops, that seem to demonstrate retrocausation. And best of all, you've got quantum computing, which is on almost I'd say a monthly basis. There's some new finding in quantum computing about how they're reversing the causal order, or they theoretically can reverse the causal or temporal order of computing operations in a quantum computer. So you could have an output before an input, or you could, the simplistic way I put it is you can send a message into the past in a quantum computer. And this is being, this is a technology that is, in its infancy right now. But I think that quantum physics, quantum computing are going to demonstrate the reality of retrocausation in a compelling enough way that other hard scientific fields are going to be less resistant to these things. And so then in quantum biology, it's going to, okay, if retrocausation is real, then this must be part of quantum biology. And then from there, you can go to imagine a quantum neuroscience that incorporates this idea. So that's one of the reasons I'm very optimistic. I think that we're going to see in the next couple decades, we're going to see kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a paradigm shift, but you're going to see movement in the highest echelons of science towards an acceptance of these kinds of ideas in the physical world. And that's going to give more permission to a younger generation of psychologists and cognitive scientists and so on to take this seriously when it comes to human behavior. So that's one reason I'm optimistic. Another reason is we're really seeing a thaw around all kinds of paranormal topics these days in popular culture. I know you know what I'm talking about with UFOs. I mean, this is a topic people are no longer making fun of it. And whatever you think of TTSA, I guess you do have to credit some of their work for getting this topic taken seriously in, New York Times articles and so on. And we're no longer seeing the flip, X-Files music, takes on the UFO topic. It's being taken seriously. Same thing is happening, interestingly, with a psychic phenomenon, ESP. just in the last couple of years, there have been some interesting examples of this. For instance, there was a really good New Yorker article about a British parapsychologist, John Barker, back in the 60s. There was a very good, very serious article about him and precognition. This was in New York, and it wasn't making fun of him or the idea of precognition. It was really excellent. This was about a year and a half ago. And then just this past week, a friend of mine emailed me a link to a Fresh Air interview on NPR with the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist AKHTAR, who has a new novel that just came out this week called Homeland Elegies. And it's sort of an autobiographical novel where he talks about his dream work and his precognitive dreams, including his precognitive dream of 9/11. And not only is this in a very, very mainstream novel from a big publisher, but he talked about this on NPR with the Fresh Air interviewer. And there was no ridicule and no sense that this is a topic worth making fun of. My books, my new book especially, I'm trying to push a sort of tipping point about the topic of precognitive dreams, at least, to where people can no longer make fun of the topic. And I think it's going to happen. I think that we're kind of ready as a culture to accept some ideas that were not acceptable a decade, 2 decades ago. I think people are more ready to accept some new and different ideas. So I'm actually really optimistic that we're going to see movement around this, and the sort of knee-jerk skeptics are just going to have to kind of shut up.
I love ending on that note. It's a wonderful updraft to conclude on. I'll put a link to John Barker's paper, which appeared in The New Yorker, the Premonitions Bureau, and I will also put a link to AKHTAR. Homeless Elegies is the novel, and we'll put a link to his appearance on NPR. All of that will be in the show notes.
By the way, just you mentioned the Pauli effect. I had just been thinking about the Pauli effect right when you said that, because when your audio quit,
yeah,
I think I had just mentioned Pauli, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And actually, this happened, the last interview I had a couple of weeks ago. I talked to Leslie Kane,
Yeah, she's great.
We had a Zoom call, and I was telling her this very amazing story about one of the precogs that I work with. And immediately when I was getting to the really amazing part of the story, she was like rapt. I mean, she's like, oh my God, what happened next? And then suddenly our connection was lost. And but the funny thing is that this is exactly what happened with the precog that I'm talking about when we started working together. Whenever, I had mentioned Wolfgang Pauli or something like that, and then suddenly her computer broke. And it took us a couple days to reestablish communication because her computer broke right when I was emailing her about Wolfgang Pauli. So it's just Wolfgang Pauli and the Pauli effect are just this constant ongoing theme.
Whoa.
in my life. So it was very funny to me, when I realized that you lost connection right after I mentioned him.
That's hilarious. That's exactly when it happened.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. That kind of stuff does not shock me anymore. Nonetheless, the comedic timing is pronounced.
Yeah.
For more information on Eric Wargo, check the show notes. Reg Presley is known worldwide as the lead singer of the Troggs, whose hits Wild Thing and Love Is All Around have endured since the mid-60s. Presley, no relation to Elvis, was also widely known within ufological circles. He was an ardent researcher, author, and experiencer. His passion for the paranormal was sparked early. At age 7, Presley and his playmates came across a crop circle in Andover and wandered into it. They began playing inside the enigmatic geometry, etched into its folded crops. Much later, in 1990, Presley read of a new crop circle in the Sunday paper. He immediately went out to find it. Upon arrival, the sight captivated him. After years of research into the phenomenon, he asserted that the vast majority of crop circles were man-made, but a small percentage were truly inexplicable and bore exotic properties. He was a dowser, and one day, this craft weirdly converged with his crop circle research. Inspecting the inside of a fresh crop circle, he spotted a man with dowsing rods. Presley commandeered them and began pacing the interior of the formation. He observed that at half the radius of the formation, the divining rods crossed. Inversely, in the center, they opened. He repeated the process numerous times and found the response consistent with each iteration. He later reported learning that geese would change their flying formation in order to avoid flying over real crop circles, seeming to react to a disturbance in the magnetic field of the formation. He even went on to host his own TV show, The Reg Presley UFO Show, which reported on recent craft sightings and other anomalous incidents. He authored the book, Wild Things They Don't Tell Us, which investigated the tandem puzzles of UFOs and crop circles. But perhaps most notable was Presley's UFO sighting in the Vale of Pusey. He recounted the event, quote, "I filmed a UFO crossing the valley. It was a light the same brightness as a star, but it was going down in brightness and then up, very slowly, moving across the valley about 3 miles from me. All of a sudden, it came up 5 times brighter and changed to orange. It remained stationary there, no noise whatsoever. The next day, there was a crop formation just where this thing had stopped, a triangle shape with circles on the corners." End quote. Aliens and Artists is brought to you by The Liminal Muse, offering one-on-one work with me, Stuart Davis. Sessions focus on creativity, spirituality, non-ordinary experiences, and transpersonal hypnotherapy. Go to theliminalmuse.com to book a session or check the show notes for a link. Greetings, terrestrial wonder spindles. Thank you for listening. If you like the show, please go to stuartdavis.com and become a patron. Just click on the Patreon button, and in no time at all, I will have all the bail money an artist could want.
They bended zinc into a miniature can, put carbon rods up in the back of a man. He's licking his frogs, it's shocking his tongue. He wanted a charge, it's making him numb. You don't know AC from fucking DC. You get a body, but it isn't for keeps. And every night you gotta die in your sleep. You'll be excarnated and still unaware. The seat of your soul is playing musical chairs. You don't get AC from flux in DC. Don't give me AC and say it's DC. Which one will clutch me? Which will release me? Whatever AC, whatever DC. Don't let it touch me, it won't release me. Sweeping the starlight under the rugs. They keep doping the kids with these invisible drugs. They keep bumping the mud into the sockets and plugs. There's a dictator born each time a teenager shrugs. You don't get AC from flux in DC. Don't give me AC and say it's DC. Which one will clutch me? Which will release me? Whatever AC, whatever DC. Don't let it touch me, The sound of one hand slapping your face before your parents were born. You don't get AC, DC.